was just trying to get used to being referred to as a national treasure. I wasn't sure how I liked it. Still not sure. And I'd hardly gotten used to it when I heard myself being called a rock star. and that's why I turned to the door to see if there was an escape route. So, thank you very much, Seth. I first want to thank all of you for coming tonight. I'm deeply honored to see how many people turned out tonight. I'm also very excited, not just because people wanted to hear me, but to echo what Jay Quauer said, that to recognize concretely how much interest there is in being a psychoanalyst and becoming a psychoanalyst, despite the fact that we live in very hard times. And I find this very exciting for that reason. And I especially want to thank Seth Aronson, who's the president of the White Society, and his board of directors for their generosity in sponsoring the meeting and the skill with which they got it organized on relatively short notice. Almost everything that I write comes out of something I've already presented somewhere. The presentation ordinarily comes first, and then the writing for publication. This is the opposite. The full version of this paper, from which this presentation is drawn, is in press, and it's scheduled to appear in the April issue of IJP, the International Journal of Psychoanalysis. I want to give you, before I start to read the paper, I want to give you a little piece of backstory about this, because I don't know if it's still funny or you're going to find it funny, but I found it hilarious while it was going on for me, how it actually came about. Now, many of you, but not all of you, would be familiar with the history of IJP, the International Journal of Psychoanalysis. You know that it's the most prestigious journal in the field, and because of its association with Freud. And it has always known that, and it has never acted as though it was anything but the most prestigious journal in the field. So its reputation has always been that you're trying to get into Fort Knox if you want to publish a paper. And their reputation has been that they've never been particularly kindly disposed to Americans, and certainly not to Americans who are not Freudians. So I've never submitted a paper there, because I didn't feel like having to go through what was a legendary process of back and forth between reviewers who would tell you how to rewrite it according to their style and rewrite it according to the content that they deemed acceptable. So I never submitted a paper. Okay. The backstory of this is that a little more than a year ago, I received a phone call from somebody, a man, who said he's on the editorial board of IJP and he's calling on behalf of the journal's education section. And I listened. Inviting me, he said, inviting me to contribute a paper on the topic of truth to be published in that section. Now, at that moment, I didn't remember what the topic was. All I heard was the word invited. And I couldn't quite process it. He was a really nice guy, and we liked each other right away. And we've since become friends. He told me that the education section, which appears in the journal regularly, but not every issue, was planning a new format and was going to publish 2 or 3 papers together that are topic related each of which would be written by a member of a different analytic community whose previous writing had led the board of that section to believe that they had something to contribute to their readers if they wrote on that topic. In this case, one of the other two authors is a prominent figure in classical ego psychology, and the second was a well-known and very interesting neo-Kleinian. And, he said, we wanted someone representing your community, which is why I'm calling you. What community do you mean? I replied. And I didn't quite think he had the wrong phone number, but it was close. Oh, he said, the relational community. Are you sure you know who you're calling, I asked, only half joking. Oh yes, he said. No, so you know that my thinking is interpersonal, and that even though I refer to myself as an interpersonal relational analyst, the foundation of what I believe in and what I do is interpersonal. We not only know that, he said, that's why we want you. No, another long pause. You know, good sense would have told me to quit while I was ahead at that point. But I couldn't. So I asked why. The answer I got was that they believed their readership would learn a lot that they should know, and that because they don't tend to read American journals that are outside of their own kosher loop, the education section wanted me to educate them. We want your paper to show the way in which the concept of truth is relevant to how you think about clinical process and what you do as an analyst. We know you will not be speaking for the entire relational community, and we don't want you to try. So, after a little questioning on my part, he promised that their policy of not blind reviewing invited papers would be totally honored, and I accepted. Though I never quite believed that the promise was going to be upheld, the no reviewing. But some part of me genuinely doubted that they'd given interpersonalists that much latitude. Well, I was dead wrong. The paper was accepted. I was informed that they loved it, and not one word was changed, not even in the copy editing. So, that's the backstory. The version that you're now going to hear is drastically cut. I eliminated almost all references, and some material, the absence of which may lead you to think, why didn't he mention that? Most unfortunately, I cut out one section for the sake of time that, although perhaps the most interesting, is also the one that requires the most thought, and therefore will be better grasped if it's read than listened to. It's a section on the mind-brain interface in relation to enactment, developmental trauma, attachment, and clinical process. You know, I'm now cunningly trying to tantalize you into reading the whole thing when it comes out in April. The reason I bothered with this preamble is that I'm hoping you'll listen to the paper not only as you would ordinarily listen, but within the larger context of it being written as a piece to introduce an international audience largely made up of ego psychologists, Kleinians, and British middle school analysts to a perspective they might be interested in knowing about, but probably wouldn't go out of their way to find out about on their own. Okay, I'm going to begin, and I want to start by reading the epigram with which the paper begins. I thought I wasn't going to read it because of time, but I love it too much to leave it out. It's from Lawrence Stern's Tristram Shandy, which was written in the mid-18th century. It goes this way. So often has my judgment deceived me. that I always suspected, right or wrong. For all this, I reverence truth as much as anybody. And when it has slipped us, if a man will but take me by the hand and search for it, as for a thing we have both lost, and can neither of us do well without, I'll go to the world's end with him. That's
Very nice.
quotation. Okay, here we go. Many years ago, while trying to impress my first analytic supervisor, or the candidate, with a story about my highly compliant patient who had finally disagreed with something I said about her, I described the moment as an important event because it also made me aware that what I had said to her was not true. "What do you mean by true?" said he. Some of you may already know who it is. Taken aback and a bit irritated, I restated it a bit more loudly. You know, it wasn't true. It sounds more like it wasn't accurate, he countered. What do you mean by accurate? I asked, somewhat defiantly. One thing led to another, and even though I didn't appreciate his smugness, as the supervision went on, I increasingly appreciated the fact that whatever took place between us could always be talked about. But what I came to value most of all was the power of his distinction between truth and accuracy. Truth, as a subjective phenomenon, continues to have an important place in my clinical work, but only in the context of an ongoing dialectic with the intersubjective phenomenon of accuracy. My supervisor's openness to jointly processing our somewhat contentious moment of truth and his similar openness throughout the supervision helped me also to experience the distinction between being a psychoanalyst and doing psychoanalysis. And it's in the intrinsic tension between being and doing, like that between accuracy and truth, that allows, I believe, for the relational consensus necessary to both shaping therapeutic growth and the clinical sensibility I'll try to convey in what follows. Relational psychoanalysis is now a central piece of the psychoanalytic landscape, most notably in the United States and increasingly so internationally. The concept and the name interpersonal/relational, however, may be less familiar to some readers. So I think it would be helpful if I were to briefly contextualize it before continuing with the topic at hand. The school of relational psychoanalysis was not born of a single seminal theorist or homogeneous group of theorists from which it evolved, diverged, or remained loyal. And it's thereby not subject to evaluation by its degree of deviation from orthodoxy. I may have been writing this for the reviewers more than for the readers. Don't edit. Freud, Klein, Ferenczi, Fairbairn, Winnicott, Sullivan, and Kovat are all important parental figures, but none carries parental authority. The range of theory, moreover, is extremely diverse because the value accorded a given concept or system of concepts derived from any given figure is more clinically than theoretically determined. The term relational emerged by consensus at a meeting of a then small group of analysts. There were five of them, led by Stephen Mitchell, at which I was present. The name was selected for two reasons. It clearly and concisely represented the core viewpoint that united us, that the human mind, its normal development, its pathology, and the process of its therapeutic growth are relationally configured, and it assured that the term not be so conceptually specific, that it would convey adherence to one given set of ideas. The designation interpersonal/relational that I and many of my colleagues use to delineate the contours of our analytic identity explicitly honors the contributions of both Harry Stack Sullivan and object relational thinking, while making it plain that the concept of relational is not equivalent to object relational, nor are the two terms interchangeable. Interpersonal/relational is in its own way a tribute to the relational school's capacity to welcome the distinct identities of the analysts comprising it. A lawyer is required to accept the legitimacy of swearing under oath that something about it be said, be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. But for psychoanalysts, the concept of truth is like an itch that is never relieved by scratching. For an interpersonal relational analyst, the highest priority is determining whether a theoretical concept offers a compelling clinical framework for expanding and enriching the texture of a patient's experience. Determining whether it is a useful way of representing the patient's experience to himself. Steve Mitchell in 1993 made pointedly clear that this sensibility is far from being atheoretical. Quote, abandoning the belief in a single objective analytic truth or multiple truths that approach a single objective reality does not lead to a valueless relativism. There are an infinite number of ways to paint a vase with flowers. That does not mean they are all equally moving, that they have equal claims to capture and transform experience. End quote. So, psychoanalysis, when seen in this light, is another name for the relational crucible in which opposing truths can come to coexist. Lawrence Friedman, in his 1988 book, eloquently portrays this through the paradox of the analyst as holder of the patient's potential. He writes, and listen to this, this is absolutely a wonderful passage. One sort of childhood need, which is not only sought in analysis, but is also fulfilled by analysis, is the need to identify with one's own growth potential as seen in the eyes of a parent. Being reacted to like that not only provides hope in general, but structures reality in a relevant and promising fashion. Hope, says Friedman, is what makes a patient engage treatment and is what enables old ways of being to be surrendered. But, he says, hope can only be a present hope in the shape given it by the patient's present psychological configuration. In other words, the analyst must accept, this is Friedman speaking, in other words, the analyst must accept the patient on his own terms and at the same time not settle for them. He must accept the patient on his own terms, but at the same time not settle for them. If he does not accept the patient on his own terms, it is as though he's asking him to be someone else. The patient will not have cause for hope, and he will not recognize the analyst's vision. If the analyst settles for the patient's terms, he's ignoring the concealed part of the personality and betraying the patient's wish for greater fulfillment. End quote. What Friedman describes is best facilitated by abandoning the notion that there's a real you. People often come into treatment hoping to find out who they really are. An important goal of treatment, I would argue, is to help them recognize that the person that they either worry or hope they really are reflects a truth, no more reflects the truth about them than the parts the world sees, the parts they may think of as a cover-up that is masking a hidden, more truer part. Now, for example, in frustration with me, a patient blurted out, You're so dogmentative. Sputtering, half in laughter, half in consternation, I replied, you have no right to make up a new word. It's not fair. I had no idea what I meant by that. I only knew that she had somehow won the battle of words, because there was no way I could, as succinctly as she had, use language to neutralize the description of the way I was being. Was what she said about me true? If the word dogmentative did not exist, then how could it be true? But was it accurate? The answer that we arrived at together, only after sharing our individual experiences of our encounter, was a mutual, oh yes. But here's the point. We were able to recognize that her neologism represented different parts of herself, including one that feared her perception of me would be felt as too accurate if heard seriously, and could potentially destabilize the procedural attachment pattern that organizes her core identity, unless she came across as a little ditzy. What do I mean by different parts of herself? Those of you who are familiar with my writing already know my view that the human mind comprises a multiplicity of self-states that we inhabit every day of our lives, and that a flexible relationship among self-states through the use of normal dissociation is what allows a human being to engage the ever-shifting requirements of life's complexities with creativity and spontaneity. In other words, new self-state configurations are continually selected that are most immediately adaptive within the constraints of an individual's personality. The flexibility of this process is what gives a person the remarkable capacity to negotiate character and change simultaneously. What I call staying the same while changing. When the mind loses this self-state flexibility, therapists know about it through being confronted by one version or another of a person who is experienced as a, quote, difficult patient. Self-state flexibility is lost because dissociation also serves a protective function. It proactively assures the stability of the self by preventing the mind from experiencing chaotic traumatic affect. That is, it is designed to keep us from losing our minds, what we call depersonalizing. It is not simply a different term for the concept of repression. Now keep in mind who I'm writing this for, okay? Repression defines a process that is designed to avoid disavowed mental conflict that may lead to unpleasant intrapsychic conflict. But conflict can be unbearable to the mind, not simply unpleasant. When such is the case, dissociation is not functioning in its routine dialectic with conflict, but showing its signature through the patient's alienation from aspects of self that are inconsistent with his experience of me at a given moment. The capacity to experience internal conflict is lost, or at least compromised. Each self-state is held captive by dissociation and becomes an island of its own truth, a truth that defines reality, which is why it defies interpretation. From this perspective, reality and truth cannot be distinguished from fantasy and uncertainty in absolute terms, because the ability of different parts of the self to recognize other parts as me is always relative. Consequently, reality and truth for the part of the self that is me can be fantasy and speculation for the parts that are not me. What we call reality, and in turn what we call truth, will depend on which part of self has access to consciousness at that moment. To say it a little bit differently, truth is a concept that describes the subjective need of each self-state to feel coherent in itself without being destabilized by otherness, whether the otherness is from other self-states of your own or from the otherness possessed by another person out there. So, in other words, truth always tends to be state-dependent and subjective. It lacks what Harry Stack Sullivan called consensual validity. But this does not create problems in living unless the truth held by a particular state is so insulated that negotiation between states and with other people is compromised. In treatment, interpersonal engagement allows increased self-state negotiation to become possible, which in turn allows the state dependence of any given truth to give up some of its sovereignty to a more flexible self-other experience. As this takes place, truth becomes opinion, belief, or even conviction, but is no longer absolute certainty. As the boundary between self and other becomes increasingly permeable, the patient-analyst relationship becomes in itself a therapeutic environment in which old truths are reorganized into new patterns of self-other meaning. Okay. The next section, which is titled Dissociation and Internal Conflict, addresses what other schools of thought, particularly conflict theorists, would probably tend to find especially relevant because it directly questions the sufficiency of their model of mind. What I wrote is the following. In certain areas of every individual's personality, the experience of intrapsychic conflict is difficult to bear, much less resolve. And for some people, this incapacity goes back to early childhood, because the mind's ability to access and safely tolerate two or more disjunctive self-states at the same time was virtually foreclosed at that time. But for any patient in those areas where the natural dialectic between conflict and dissociation is either compromised or shut down, conflict interpretations are useless or even worse. You notice I repeated that. I said it before. I'm repeating it for them because I doubt whether they're going to read it the first time. I am not arguing against the concept of conflict. I'm arguing that conflict theory needs to make room to accommodate the phenomenon of dissociation as an intrinsic part of it. And I am by no means without allies from other schools of thought. Jorge Canestri, for example, some of you may be familiar with his work. He's just brilliant, a wonderful analyst and writer. In the direct challenge to those who conceptualize dissociation as a form of conflict that can be assimilated into contemporary conflict theory, writes in a 2005 paper that my hypothesis of a mental process in which a shift from dissociation to conflict takes place, quote, is very similar from the point of view of logical presuppositions to those of Winnicott, Gardini, Greenacre, and others, who predict the existence of a primary conflictual phase, with a subsequent shift that leads to the constitution of the structure and ultimately of the conflict. You may not be able to follow that completely unless you read his whole article, but basically he's agreeing with me. Canestri takes strong issue with the view that dissociation, when it appears in clinical work, is a compromise formation. and can be analyzed as such by interpretation. His main point, like mine, is that dissociation is inherently non-conflictual, and that the effort to account for the dissociative gap between self-states as though it were a stubborn version of conflict is, quote, an ad hoc hypothesis intended to salvage the theory of conflict as an organizing principle omnipresent in the mind, end quote. Now, if Canestri's critique is worth taking seriously, one must ask how it is possible for anything ever to take place in treatment. Why doesn't each self-state island of truth maintain an analytic status quo indefinitely? If an analyst does not believe that therapeutic action is predicated on the principle of successful search for truth, then what principle replaces it? I find it interesting that two different authors have approached this question by re-examining the time-honored conceptualization of resistance, each arguing that it is overly content-bound. Lee Rather, in 2001, writing from a contemporary Kleinian perspective, put it that, quote, resistance occurs not only to the specific contents of the unconscious, but also to the very existence of the other, from which unconscious phenomena are felt to emanate. The aim of psychoanalysis may be, in one way, conceptualized as the formation of a collaborative internal relation with an aspect of the psyche I have termed the unconscious other, unquote. Now, Rather's broad implication is that by expanding the concept of resistance beyond its tie to unconscious content, the fundamental source of unconscious phenomena, the internal world of self-other configurations, will be freer to participate more directly and spontaneously in the clinical process. What he calls the unconscious other, I call not me self-states following Sullivan. Dissociated constellations of affective reality that become part of me as analyst and patient engage and process one another's otherness through unplanned here and now interaction. Adam Phillips in 1993 similarly argues that the concept of resistance, traditionally conceptualized as a repetition of the past in different terms, is more usefully understood as resistance to surprise or novelty. He too offers the view that there has been such a pronounced focus on unconscious content that a collusion between theory and observation obscures the analyst's clinical experience that, quote, what is repressed in advance is the novelty of the experience, end quote. In that phrase, Phillips is setting the stage for what I and many other post-classical analysts would support as an organizing frame of reference that replaces the concept of analytic truth and its powerful pull towards unilateral clinical judgment. When the latter prevails, that is unilateral clinical judgment, says Philip, the relationship to truth, this is a quote, becomes a sadomasochistic one, truth being that which it is better for us to submit to, end quote. Extrapolating from the shared argument presented by Rather and Phillips, I would add that the focus on content creates a collusion between patient and analyst that leads to searching for what seems to be hidden within the patient and masks what is absent between them in the here and now. Affective awareness of something taking place between their not-me self-states that both partners have dissociatively bled a personal meaning. At points a resistance. The novelty of a new experience is not available to be addressed because the mind-brain in advance, to quote Donald Stern, drains experience of the feeling and the potential for narrative vigor, end quote. The next section is one I've titled, Why Relational is Always Interpersonal Relational. Yeah, I finally got there. It's a title that I suppose that could be seen as a little bit biased, but I had permission to be biased, you remember. So I unapologetically want you to listen to this section especially closely. I argue that the therapeutic action of psychoanalysis takes place through an interpenetration between interpersonal engagement and the self-states that organize the internal object worlds of both patient and analyst. If it is an affectively alive process, it will allow enacted self-state truths to be cognitively and linguistically symbolized through the involved minds of both partners. And it takes place most powerfully during spontaneous and unbidden interpersonal interaction. Interpersonal novelty is what allows the self to grow because it is unanticipated and belongs to neither person alone. It is the developing synthesis of interpersonal interaction and the processing of dissociated self-state enactments that leads to what could be called the therapeutic internalization of otherness. As the joint processing of dissociated self-state communication progresses, a patient gradually becomes more able to sort out interpersonally and between self-states what can scare from what can scar, without shutting down. A feedback loop is created between increasing capacity for spontaneity and reduced fear of affect dysregulation, which leads a patient to permit more dissociated areas of developmental trauma to be relived in the moment as part of a caring but humanly imperfect relationship that frees his internal object world from captivity. The analytic relationship is one in which the analyst is responding affectively and personally to all parts of the patient, each in their own terms. Through the mutuality of these encounters, patient and analyst are able to make therapeutic use of their collisions of personal truth. But each patient and analyst couple must strike its own balance between safety and risk. For any patient, however, confrontation with the analyst as a separate center of subjectivity must be both enlivening and safe. And it will be if the analyst is not trying to figure things out on his own and then using his own truth about his patient as a means to a good therapeutic outcome. Honoring this principle allows many fragile patients to hang in while facing, I have quotation marks over the word fragile, to hang in while facing an analyst's seeming intrusion because the patient is not putting his own subjectivity at risk by having to trade it off for the truth being offered by an other. I believe it is this that accounts for why a relationship that is what I call safe but not too safe is a risk that a patient is able to take. Winnicott describes the developmental process that leads to the capacity to be alone in very much these same terms. I quote, "The basis of the capacity to be alone is the experience of being alone in the presence of someone. I suggest that ego-relatedness might be a good term for temporary use. It is in a frame of ego-relatedness, id relationships occur. and strengthen rather than disrupt the immature ego. Gradually, the ego's supportive environment is interjected and built into the individual's personality, so there comes about a capacity to actually be alone. End quote. Winnicott is saying that through the internalization of a bond he calls ego-relatedness, a capacity to actually be alone comes into being because a relationally nourishing inner world develops out of what had earlier depended on the external presence of the other. And, most important, is saying that within this shared state, the ego is strengthened rather than disrupted by having to deal with some self-other noise. It seems plausible to me that Winnicott's point about id relationships strengthening rather than disrupting a state of ego-relatedness is intimately connected to the mature development of the capacity for affect regulation. And to my view that the process of what I call collision and negotiation is therapeutic because it allows encounters with otherness to become not just less frightening, but pleasurably livening. Why should pleasurably even matter? John Klauber has written in 1980, declared that his understanding of Freud's long-term aim of psychoanalysis, where id was, there shall ego be, is that, quote, the ego must require an increased tolerance for crude impulse, thus increasing the number of satisfactions which can become available. Be that as it may, Klauber says, some internalization of the analytic process, perhaps in modified form, accompanied by an increased capacity for instinctual satisfaction, provide practical and logical criteria for analytic success. Such an outcome implies that the patient has enjoyed the analytic process, which I will not here further try to define, end quote. I remember when I first read this piece by Klauber many years ago, I said to myself, boy, I'd like to meet this guy someday, if this is how he defines psychoanalysis. So I'm suggesting that in order for a patient to truly take pleasure in the analytic process, the analytic relationship has to be affectively alive to all parts of the self. And in this sense, I think that Klauber's understanding of how Freud saw the long-term aim of psychoanalysis is a not unreasonable standard of successful analytic work. If Freud were alive, he'd argue that Klauber's opinion is not true. But I wonder if over time, they might together arrive at something they felt was accurate. Thank you.